But when they realized to build, quote unquote, the Amazon of Africa, we actually needed to build like vast logistics and fulfillment networks. And I was part of that journey initially at Conga. And then I realized, you know what, this problem isn't just something that was specific to Conga. Everyone needed it, right? From Jumia to Conga to Payport and all the other e-commerce guys that were coming up. So for a while we struggled, right? We didn't want to buy vehicles for drivers. Like, if you acquire a vehicle, then you then become some sort of bank, because now
and
you're
then there's a whole question
assets.
of scale as well.
And then there's a question of scale. So I didn't fully understand how to pitch, especially to a US audience. The African culture is a little more European in nature, much more conservative, humble. You don't put yourself out too much. And then I remember the culture shock watching my American friends pitch like, wow.
You're like, is it the same business that we just talked about 5 minutes ago?
Like, what is this? He as well wanted to come back to the continent to do something very exciting. He was trying to build an e-commerce startup at that time. And then we met up and I explained to him, I just did some work with an e-commerce company, and the biggest problem they faced was...
Welcome to The Startup Leap, the #1 podcast interviewing startup founders who have taken the leap into starting their own businesses.
Here on The Startup Leap, we hear real, raw, and relatable stories of these entrepreneurs, how they've navigated taking the leap, and the decisions they've made. We're your hosts.
I'm Yvonne.
And I'm Maria.
And this is the Startup Leap podcast.
Yvonne and Maria are partners at Local Globe and OpenSeed VC, respectively. Local Globe and OpenSeed are independent of the Startup Leap podcast. Any statements made by Maria, Yvonne, or the Startup Leap guests are solely their view and are not advice. Endorsements by the Startup Leap, its guests, Maria and Yvonne.
Hello, and welcome to another episode of The Startup Leap. Today, we will be speaking with a leader in the logistics space in Africa and Nigeria, the founder of Max. There are over 600 mobility startups in Africa across ride-hailing, logistics. It's a burgeoning sector, but this founder has started building in this space almost 10 years ago. So it's an exciting one because they have gone through the phases of getting into a market early, fundraising. They've raised over $40 million from incredible investors across the world, Global Launch Ventures. We have things like Nova Star. They have also raised debt. So we're going to be going into a lot on the episode today. So welcome, Tayo.
Hey.
Thank you, Maria. Good to be here.
Before we kick off, one of the things that I thought is very fascinating about Max and your story is the fact that you got in very, very early.
Yeah.
Right now, EVs, electric vehicles, logistics, it's the in thing. The last 5 years, it's more exciting now than 10 years ago. I'm very, very curious. In 2009, when you started, 2015, thereabout, what was the landscape like? And before we even go into your leap story, paint us a picture as to what mobility in Africa looked like at the time when you started thinking about Max.
All right, sure. It's changed. Mobility has changed quite a bit. It's evolved, still evolving, obviously, as you said. But back then, there wasn't a lot of innovation in yet. It was still pretty much traditional, right? Minibuses, Okadas, or bodas as we call them in East Africa. And tuk-tuks, kekes as well. And taxis were mostly the old school taxis that would park at street junctions, and then you'll have to hail them, or you have their phone numbers, and have to call them up.
There was one easy taxi at some point. Like, you literally had to call taxis. Can't remember.
Yes,
I can't imagine that now.
It was pretty old school back then. Of course, Uber had started in the US and started expanding. I think Bolt, picked that up later on. But initially, at the very beginning, it was Uber and Lyft, right? There wasn't much of that in Africa. So it was very old school. And then we jumped in. But before we jumped in, I think to your point on what the landscape was like, there wasn't even any focus on automating logistics, right? Mm-hmm. The whole startup movement in West Africa, and for the most part across the continent, started with folks like Jumia and Conga, right?
And that was more last mile, right? Like, because they had to build that infrastructure for last mile fulfillment.
Yeah. So the digitization of the logistics and mobility industry started from trying to solve a problem for the e-commerce pioneers like Conga and Jumia, who needed, as you said, last mile delivery services, because they were struggling with how to figure out recruiting drivers, managing deliveries, making it super efficient, etc. Even for them, actually, it was an afterthought, right?
And you were at Conga, right?
Yes, I was at Conga briefly with Sim Shagaya. Fun times. So yeah, it started out with e-commerce guys trying to figure out how to scale, right? Even for them, it was an afterthought, right? But when they realized, oh, actually, to build quote unquote the Amazon of Africa, we actually need to build like really, really, vast logistics and fulfillment networks. So the e-commerce guys started building that out, and I was part of that journey initially at Conga, and then I realized, you know what, this problem isn't just something that was specific to Conga. Everyone needed it, right? From Jumia to Conga to Payport and all the other e-commerce guys that were coming up. I realized there was something to be done here. So I jumped in blindly.
Took the leap. The way you said blindly, you're like, if I knew what I know now, I don't know.
Tell me about it.
But that naivety helps, right? Because maybe if you knew what was ahead of you, you wouldn't have taken the leap.
I mean, I mean, as they say, right? Hindsight is 20/20.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, still grateful for all of the learnings. But yeah, tons of learnings, right? Mistakes here and there. But yeah, what matters is we're still here, right?
Yeah.
So overall, it's been quite a rewarding journey. But I mean, we'll get into the details of that.
Yeah. And before you even joined Conga, you were a founder first. You started a business, then became a consultant and operator. I love the varied angles of your experience. And I think it probably would have played into how you are as a founder. So I'd love to talk about your road to Conga. You started a startup in your early, I guess, career.
Yeah.
What was that like? Have you always had that instinct to see problems and want to solve them? What was the first startup? Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, sure. If it's okay, I could even go a little further back. I'm the last child, right, of my parents, and the older one, the next after me is 5 years ahead of me, right? So I pretty much grew up lonely, right? They all left the house pretty early, so it was me with my parents in the house all the time.
How many kids did you say? How many siblings do you have?
Five of us.
Okay.
It's 5 of us. And my parents were quite not too strict, but also not like hyper liberal, but sort of like allowed me to figure out my way through life, right? And my dad is an academic, so there are lots of books in the house, right? So I often read stuff, and just try to explore, right? But I was alone a lot, so I sort of
What were you into when you were young?
Sorry?
What were you into?
Music, right? I play the piano, so I taught myself how to play the piano, right?
You taught yourself?
Yes, I did.
Oh, wow. That's amazing.
I had that much time. I had that much time, right? So yeah, I mean, I had friends in the neighborhood that would play with it as well. But my oldest brother, he studied computer science, right? And he would bring computers home, and I started wondering what was all this stuff about, right? So I sort of had that initial opportunity to understand what computers were, right? And then he studied computer science, I studied computer science as well, following after him very closely. But yeah, I think growing up, I was alone a lot, so that allowed me to experiment and, try to figure out things, play around with things, toys, gadgets, eventually computers. The first models of the Palm Pilot back in the day.
I remember that.
Yeah.
Oh my God,
Played
that
around
was
with
such cool
HP
tech at the time. But
Yes,
now
it
I'm
was.
just like, no.
Oh yeah, it was something else then. It was like out of something really exceptional back then. But anyway, fast forward, got into uni, computer science major, and then taught myself how to code as well. Right, there wasn't a lot to learn back then from my university around.
Yes, the COBOLs and
particularly around
Pascals
modern
and-
programming languages.
Yeah.
Yes, COBOL and Pascal and all that stuff. Yeah. So taught myself Visual Basic, taught myself Java. I would often do assignments even for some of my classmates, right, in class. Just really figuring out this whole computer thing, building software. So to your point around my first startup, not venture funded, of course, right?
Yeah. No, but I feel like people, I don't really think that that's a marker of success, to be honest. Like a startup is, you
Yeah.
saw a problem, this thing didn't exist, you created it,
Yeah.
now it exists, now that problem is solved. Like venture is an add-on. So in
Yeah.
my mind, I would say that is legitimate in and of itself.
Fair enough.
Without venture.
That's a good point.
And I mean,
Yeah.
think about the proportion of companies that actually raise venture, it's very
It's really
limited.
small.
Right?
Yeah.
Fair enough. Yeah, you're absolutely right. So anyway, my first adventure into the entrepreneurship space was building software, interestingly, for a vehicle tracking company.
Really?
Yeah.
But at
So
that
you were
time, I
already
never-
thinking about the
You did.
mobility space quite
So
early.
I didn't know it was ultimately going to lead me to come back and do something in the transport mobility space, right? So I think that was 2003, 2004, just before I left school. So they needed some communication protocol to help manage comms amongst their trackers, right? It was also the telco infrastructure was new in Nigeria back then. The MTNs, the Airtels. I think back then it was called Econet or something.
Yeah.
Were just building out their networks, and it was really fascinating all of the opportunities that infrastructure was unlocking. Back then, vehicle theft was very common in Nigeria, right? So when people learned about this thing that you could put in your car that could help you
Track your
track
company.
it was very exciting. So there was a company, actually my brother-in-law's company, right? He was buying trackers and installing in vehicles for people, and he needed some software to help him make that a bit more efficient. So I built that for him, and he paid me, right, which was really nice, because I mean the whole concept of running a business and getting paid, because I was just doing it for fun initially, right? Not like I started it to make a lot of money, and then I got paid. I was like, oh wow, actually you can get paid for writing code. Okay, I'll do more of that. But eventually did a few more projects, but my mom thought I needed to get a proper job because she was like,
These projects you are doing, get a job.
Get a job, right?
Was this post uni or was you?
So this was post uni. So I started doing this before I left uni, but I continued doing it shortly after uni. And then at some point, my folks thought I needed to get a proper job and build a proper career, right? But anyway, so eventually I left that, right, and then worked in consulting. I worked for an FMCG company as well for a little bit.
Even a gas company.
And then I went to work for oil and gas as well. Working at an oil and gas company where I spent about 5 years, right? But of course, 2 years in, actually, I got pretty tired of it. Right? but the money was good, right?
Yeah.
But eventually, it was a matter of time before I ultimately decided I needed to do something much more exciting, right? And then the other part of my story also is my dad did a lot of work in development research. So he did stuff for like WHO, UNICEF, analyzing data for them. So I also grew up, of course, reading some of his project books and all of that, and just learning about development, poverty, statistics, economic development, why is Africa poor, blah, blah, blah. And that also played something in my head at some point, right? So on the one hand, I had this passion for tech. On this other hand, I had this passion for development. I think back then it was even a bit more political, right?
Yeah.
Obviously, I would never touch politics, but then
Never say never, but okay.
But I genuinely wanted to do something to help, my country, my continent move forward. And of course, maybe I'm still a little naive. I felt like, I alone could make a lot of difference, right? If I figured out how to use this technology thing because what tech helped me understand then was scale, right? Like, with one simple app, I could impact millions, if not billions of people, right? If I got things right. So I felt that I could use technology as a tool to drive social change. So it was a matter of time. Oil and gas didn't exactly feel like how to drive social change.
I was saying recently, it's so funny how oil and gas used to be the thing, and now it's like not the thing.
Yeah, it's amazing, right? How times change. So, but even beyond that, I remember when I was in oil and gas, I read a few books, right, that chronicled the Dutch disease, right, and how natural resources have been responsible for a lot of the poverty and corruption on the continent. I remember reading one particular one that was so vivid and so graphic. And after I finished reading that book, I would go to work every day feeling guilty, right? Because the company that I work for, fantastic organization, done really well for themselves and for the country, for Nigeria. It's a Nigerian company called Nigeria LNG. But it was fascinating because every morning I would drive from where we lived, right? Like the residential area to the industrial area. And both areas were, of course, very well built, very nice. But the villages that you would drive through were like, dead poor, like absolute abject poverty. And of course, it was not exactly the fault of the company. But for me, it was just looking at the industry as a whole that, so much value was being extracted out of these communities in the Niger Delta. But at the same time, there was so much underdevelopment and so much poverty, right? And then I asked myself a few questions. Okay, if this thing really, was good, why hasn't it transformed its community, right? And then ultimately for me, I was going to leave, and when the opportunity opened up, I applied for a grad program at MIT, a bunch of other schools. I was lucky to get into the Sloan program at MIT, and then off I went. Yeah.
And was the idea behind that you would do that program and then look what would be next? Or did you go into that knowing that you wanted to pursue the path within technology and impact?
I wanted to do something with tech and with impact. I didn't know what it would be exactly, right? But I knew I didn't want to be in oil and gas anymore, for sure, right?
That you didn't, you were like, I know I don't want, yeah.
Absolutely. So some sort of leap of faith. But also I think beyond that was just the opportunity to connect with like really, really smart people, right? I think that was the number one objective for me at that point in time. I remember when I started my first semester at Sloan, in my class, all my classmates were introducing themselves, and there was a guy who had been one of the engineers who worked on the 787 engine. I was like, wow. And another guy had launched a satellite into space. I was like, yeah, this is where I want to be, right? Of course, then when it was my turn to talk about what I'd done, I've done oil and gas, built a few apps. But it's okay. They say if you are, you adjust to those around you. So I was in the right company. But that was really the objective, just to get out into this community of really smart people who really wanted to change the world. And of course, it was a matter of time before I sort of figured out what I wanted to do as well.
It's an MBA program, right?
Yes.
Was it helpful in retrospect? Because MBA has very polarizing views. Yes. I used to be on one end, and then I moved over to the other end. In retrospect, with the benefit of hindsight, what did that experience unlock for you in your entrepreneurial journey?
Yeah, I mean, as with everything, it's nuanced, right? It depends on what MBA, where, and where you are in your life journey as well, right? Then, as you said, I think now you don't need an MBA to build a tech company, right? But back then, it was a bridge to sort of move out of my background, my legacy background, which was still pretty interesting, but not at the level that I wanted, to this environment where there were really smart people, all having different interests, of course. But I think with the MBA programs are different. With the MIT program was particularly different because it allowed you to take classes from across the entire MIT community, right? So I did classes at the Media Lab, for example, where I connected with a lot of people who are different from the MBA types, right? And I had another friend of mine who were on sort of like a similar journey. We would often, joke about, all the idiots are in the MBA class.
People say this, actually. It's a running joke that, in university communities, the MBAs are not the most technical.
Fair enough. And there's some truth to that, right?
Yeah.
So we found a lot of excitement on the other side of campus with the engineers and where a lot of technical innovation was going on, right? But still, the business school itself was still really exciting. There were really smart people there as well who are trying to, disrupt other industries. You always have the traditional folks who want to go back into big tech or consulting, and nothing wrong with that, of course, right? We used to call that the dark side, right? But those of us who wanted what we thought was the right side, but now,
You realize that was the real dark side. You've gone through a lot.
We ultimately took the real dark side. But but MBA programs I think are still really worth it, right? I think ultimately it's up to the person. If you're looking for a particular experience or you want to take a break, you're right, definitely helpful. But in my case, it was really for discovery and for connecting with smart, super smart people, and it served that purpose. So it was really, really good. It was very expensive, but good return on investment for me personally. Yeah.
So paint the picture of what came next after the MBA, because obviously you'd been surrounded by incredible people.
Yeah.
I can imagine that exposure just fueled your imagination, right? So when that program finished, how did you decide what to do next?
Okay, great. So there are tons of entrepreneurship competitions on campus, right? Projects, etc. I also took a bunch of classes. There's a really popular one called New Enterprises, taught by a guy called Bill Ollett, and he's written this book, 21 Steps to Discipline Entrepreneurship, 21 Steps to Building a Venture, something like that. So there was a lot of learning and excitement. And then ultimately I was like, you know what, actually, I can do this stuff, right? I can build a venture as well. So I started by working with other teams. So you could join. There was always one team or the other trying to build something. Of course, a lot of them didn't necessarily go on to build or launch those ventures full time. But in my first year, that was what I did. So I worked with a lot of teams that are trying to innovate and just learn from them, from the experience. And that was very exciting. And then in my second year, in between my first and my second year, that was when I did some work with Conga, right? Interestingly, I did 2 internships, right? I did one with a development consulting firm, right?
Kind of going back to your development route.
Yeah. And then, it wasn't very fun, right?
To put it lightly, I can see the political correctness coming through.
I mean, great, but great company, really smart people. I think I remember working on a brief that was a product about the World Bank, something like that, right? And looking through some of the data. And at some point I was just like, wow, these people. I mean, I grew up like having tons of respect for, development finance institutions, and I still respect a lot of them, right? I've taken money from some of them, so I have to be careful.
We love you. You're amazing.
So they're amazing. But I remember, seeing some of the stuff they were working on. I was like, okay, how does this stuff really how does this impact on, someone's life on the ground, right? And I felt like, a lot of the time, energy, resources were going into projects that I felt wouldn't ultimately deliver impact, or they were going into projects that ultimately would have to depend on politicians to implement.
Right.
And, we know how that can be, right? Depending on politicians to implement projects, they might have to wait forever.
It's probably not a great strategy.
Probably never going to happen.
Yeah.
So the second half of my internship, right, which was actually quite interesting, I left school early, right, to be able to do that. And I asked for permission from some of the professors in school, and they were like, sure, go explore, right? So the second was with Conga, right? And it was chaos from start to finish. But I totally enjoyed that chaos, right? Trying to build a venture. I remember back then, our Sim Shaga would come into some meetings and hit the table, guys, what are we doing, right?
What exactly were you doing then?
So I was helping out with building out the outsourced logistics, right? Because the company was growing much faster than its delivery capabilities. Initially, I'd say we brought in a few third-party companies like DHL, FedEx to help out with deliveries, but I mean, they couldn't figure it out. Right?
Yeah.
It's very different from delivering like traditional parcels, right?
Yeah.
Here, you're delivering, and then in many instances, you'll have to collect cash.
Yeah.
So they were dealing with so many complexities, cash on delivery, etc.
I would love to talk about that because I think that there are different nuances between the logistics sector in other countries than Africa.
Yes.
There is this huge infrastructure here in Europe, for example, where last mile, you don't necessarily have to think of it as a business, but the public transportation and logistics infrastructure is not really by the government. Like in places like Africa, you have, buses, downfalls, you mentioned. These are private individuals who offer these services. So there's literally no infrastructure to work with as a business.
Yeah.
Like there's no like local postal,
No.
So you have to
paper, but yeah.
I mean,
I
but
remember back at the time I was doing diligence on the Congas and the Jumias, and one thing that the IC really struggled with was there's no address system. How do products get delivered?
Yeah.
So let's get into that.
Yeah, it was a nightmare, right? To put it mildly.
Yeah.
But the startups back then, Jumia, Conga, PayPal, etc., they invested a lot of money, right, into it. And, investing in vehicles, hiring drivers, building mobile apps to support last mile delivery, building cash on delivery systems to manage reconciliations.
It's like so many things you have to
layers
build.
that they had to build.
It's like you're building the rails and then you're building the business at the same time.
Absolutely.
So you were like, you know what, these rails need to be built
Absolutely.
anyway. So maybe I branch out and try to build
Absolutely.
that.
So that was the thinking. That was the thinking for me, right? But still, even when we branched out and I launched Max with Chinedu, we still severely underestimated the amount of work that needed to be done, right? Because as you said, there were no addresses, right? Even recruiting drivers and training them on how to do deliveries properly.
Consistency of the service
customer service was really bad. Customers would
A lot of this is I resonate a lot of it, especially on the Uber side as well.
Yeah.
Because there's supply, there's driver quality, and supply, then there's reliability.
Absolutely.
And then people are like, I can't get, you're like, look, the market.
So tell me about it.
There's just not enough drivers.
Yeah.
And then even when you train drivers, there's churn, but then there's also quality issues.
Yeah.
Then we're not even talking about like the the infrastructure, like
Yes.
the roads, the repairs. Like, so it's like so many issues. But I do think that it's a rewarding thing to build because it's such a catalyst.
Absolutely. I mean, it's, as they say, right, the way you build a monopoly or a moat is, doing something really, really hard, right? Exactly. It's just that it's really hard. But if you're able to overcome and build it, then, you probably would have most of the market to yourself.
Yeah.
And as you said, right, there are the complexities that were internal to your business, but then there were the external complexities, right? Like, for example, dealing with agberos, right?
Yeah, and for context, agberos are like, they call them area boys, but these are just, I don't even know how to explain it, but like, they're just like, I would say it's like a roadmap.
Shadow government.
Essentially.
Yeah.
And they also are a huge part of the transport system. So
absolutely.
in the UK or Europe, for example, where you might have like the bus system or the trains, in Africa, especially in maybe Nigeria in context, is quite different.
Yeah, it is.
Yes, now we have some government buses, but we have private buses that are run by these agberos. And they're critical parts of the system.
Oh, yeah, they are.
They're entrepreneurs, but they're also quite, let's say rough and rugged, because
a little rough, not too rough.
Just too much, not too much. And there's no, I would say, like, the systems that govern how they act is not necessarily government influenced.
No, it's not.
I think it's very communal. Like, they have like, it's very,
yeah.
So that's just for context for our viewers or listeners who don't know who
Absolutely.
So imagine having to deal with that as a business model. Like,
that's tough.
Where do you put it in your like budget? Like, how do you even account for the fact that agberos are going to stop that bus and they're not going to be able to move? So that must have been difficult.
It took about 18 to 24 months before, because initially when I changed about building the company in the US, right, and then we got into textiles in New York, etc. Most of the thinking was still driven by a Western mindset, right?
Yeah.
Of things being done properly, right? And not accounting for a lot of the nuances that you find in developing and frontier markets. So it took us about 18 months to readapt our product design process to incorporate the realities of our local context.
I would love to talk about that, managing your investors as well, because sometimes you're trying to explain.
Yeah.
And it's like, there's just no frame of reference for what you're trying to explain, but it's a reality for you on the ground. How did you navigate that?
Yeah, so our first set of investors at our seed stage was mostly US investors. So for them, like most of them, they didn't understand what was going on the continent, right? But at the same time, I remember one of the investors that came on board very early on, when he heard me pitch, he was like, wow, that's very exciting. And then, he mentioned in the possible, like, that sounds like a moonshot. I'm like, yeah, it is a moonshot, right? Meaning that, this stuff sounds like really exciting, but from what I've heard about Africa, this stuff might be really difficult, but maybe you can pull it off, right? So for North American investors, they didn't fully understand, the nuances and the dynamics of actually building and scaling a tech venture. But then that's so tech, and that's all we needed. But from our A round, we brought on board European investors who also know Africa quite a bit, right? And then African investors as well, Africa-based venture funds. So at that point, it wasn't as hard to explain, right? And also the Africa-based and European-based investors, right, also were very helpful in educating some of the US investors that we had on our cap table, right? So it wasn't such a difficulty post-Series A, but pre-Series A, there was always a translation challenge. It was always really hard.
I bet.
I want to take a step back. You mentioned that you did textiles. Now, not all accelerators are created equal.
Yeah.
How was your experience doing the accelerator, particularly being in the US?
Yeah.
And obviously the accelerator is probably quite removed from realities of doing business in Africa. How did you find it? Did you find it useful? And for anyone thinking about doing an accelerator, what are some key considerations?
Yes, that's a really good question. I think we were quite fortunate. I think irrespective of where what country you're in or what accelerator program you're doing, what matters ultimately are the people, right? Who's actually leading the accelerator, right? Back then, the guy who was leading Textiles New York is a guy called Alex Siskel. He runs a fund now, 2014 Ventures.
I didn't know it was him actually, but I know him. Yeah,
it is Alex. Alex is immigrated to the US from Ukraine, right? And the moment we met with Alex, right? Because Ukraine is also at that point was some sort of like developing country as well. He understood everything right away, right? He understood the struggles, the challenges, but he also understood the opportunity as well. So the single reason why we went to the Textiles New York program was because of Alex, right? He understood what needed to be done. And he's been extremely helpful even till now, right? We essentially built a lifelong relationship with Alex and Chinedu. So that was a big factor that drove that. So the program was very helpful and very useful for us. Provided a lot of advice and insights on also how to, having a developing world background, how to navigate, right, the American market, because he'd done that and built a fairly decent reputation for himself. So it was a really good program for us. In fact, he went as far as getting us mentors who he knew had some sort of emerging market experience and could provide really, really good coaching and mentorship to us. So it was really helpful. I mean, people still think about, should I do an accelerator or not? But it depends on what you want to achieve, right? But in our case, Textiles was amazing. Alex was incredible. And we'll do it all over again.
I love that. Did you meet Chinedu? You mentioned Chinedu, your co-founder.
Yes.
How did you meet?
So we met at Sloan at MIT, right? There was an African community there, right? But most of our folks from the continent who were doing one program or the other on campus, some wanted to experiment with this whole venture thing, but most wanted to go back into like big tech.
After those loans, you need to go back.
Those loans. I mean, when I think about it as well, for actually, I mean, we had student loans as well, and I mean, I don't know, right? Like,
I understand. There's some people. Let's just say some people are more passionate.
I think the passion was so strong, we weren't thinking clearly. But yeah, so he as well wanted to come back to the continent to do something very exciting. And then he was trying to build an e-commerce startup at that time. Mm-hmm. And then we met up and I explained to him, I just did some work with an e-commerce company, and the biggest problem they faced was with logistics and fulfillment. So maybe you should hold off with your e-commerce project for now, and let's work together to build the logistics infrastructure that will be needed. So when we're done building it, you could go back to build your e-commerce company. But of course, he's been stuck with me ever since. So that was how we connected. He wanted to do something on the continent. That drive, that passion was there from day one. We had a few other team members as well. There was actually about 7 of us at the very beginning, right? But post graduation, everybody else dropped off.
Yeah, some people were more keen than others.
Exactly.
And when you think about the two of you, we often speak about the complementary skill sets amongst co-founders and so on.
Yeah.
How did you two work together? What was it that you saw in each other in terms of roles, responsibilities? How did you navigate that as well in terms of building out the early team where there may have been gaps?
Yeah, so we were both technical. He was more technical than I was, right? I stopped coding for a few years, about 2 years before then. He was still actively coding, right? And continued to for a while. We were both technical. I had more Africa experience, obviously. Changed his career as being completely in the US, right? I also understood the industry a little bit more because at the time I spent with Conga, etc. Right? So I came in with a bit more experience of the problem itself. He was a lot more technical at that time, right? Obviously, over the years we've grown, immensely. We've learned a lot. So we can. Actually, he can do more of my job. I can't do as much as his own, but he can do most of what I do as well now. But I think beyond our core technical skills was a really strong passion for the continent, right? We both wanted to move back immediately to build something. And I would also say we both were, a combination of being naive and also having a high, pain threshold, right? We've gone through, really tough times together. And never for once did we talk about, maybe this stuff isn't working, let's go find a job. We both joked that nobody would hire us, right? So we have to make this thing work, right?
There's no choice.
We don't have much of a choice here. And that has proven to be super, super critical for the journey that we've been on. Both of us just really understanding that we wanted to really do this. Obviously, if we made money along the line for ourselves, that would be really, really helpful, right? To pay off student loans and survive. But beyond that was a really deep interest in solving this specific problem and also coming back to the continent to do stuff. That was really strong for both of us.
How did Max solve the problem? What was the initial USP? Obviously, you'd spent some time at Conga, and Conga was growing really fast, but the fulfillment arm wasn't growing as fast. So was it a vanilla, let's just be this outsourced, fulfillment company?
Yeah.
Maybe talk a little bit about what the initial USP was and how that evolved over time.
Great. the customer for us initially was Conga, Jumia, the delivery companies, small to medium enterprises that needed logistics services, right? So we built around that. And we got a certain level of growth. I think about 2 years in, and then, I don't know if you remember that report by McKinsey, Lions on the Move,
Yes.
right?
Yeah.
There was a lot of excitement, 2012, 13, 14, and then 15. And then I think 16, 17,
Things went.
started
shaking.
right? And then the Lions became
Stress. There's just a little stress.
a little stressed, right? And then we also, of course, we saw that in the growth of the e-commerce platforms, right, in Nigeria. They weren't growing as quickly as we thought anymore. We thought they would. And of course, by inference, the other challenge for us was then we realized that, you know what, we've actually built a business whose success was driven by the success of another venture, another business model. So the moment the demand for deliveries, started, slowing down, that of course impacted on us immediately. So we learned a few lessons. One is, okay, we need to pivot to a model where we were fully in control of our destiny, at least from a customer or a demand standpoint, right? That was number one. Number two was, we are not an SME, right? We could optimize the business, become profitable, but it wouldn't be a huge business.
How
right?
far into the journey did you have that realization? How many years?
About 2.5 years, 2 to 2.5, about 24 to 30 months, right? Because at that point in time, also we started trying to raise our Series A, right? And we realized that this model is great, right? But from the way the market was evolving, it didn't look like we could build a really massive business from this.
And can I ask, from the first business model, did you handle the tech and the actual vehicles? I would love to talk about the initial business model.
Fantastic, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, initially we outsourced, we brought on board drivers with their own vehicles and we just built the tech.
Okay.
And then after a while, we just learned that,
But vehicle ownership is pretty low in Nigeria. I think it's like 10,000 cars are sold every year.
So for cars,
right?
for cars, really low,
But your model used like
Two and
two-wheelers and three-wheelers.
Yeah.
Yes.
So like
So
bikes and
we had those in
kekes.
abundance.
Yeah.
So with two and three-wheelers, there was a lot of them, right? But still, it was a highly fragmented market. And the quality of service to drivers was really low. And we started seeing a lot of churn, right? So we were bringing 20 drivers today, and then within another month, all of them are gone, and then we'll bring another set. But there's so many of them, so it was fine, right? But after a while, we were like, you know what, we can't build a business model with constant churn, right, of drivers. And then realized at some point that, our customer were the delivery companies, but the most critical piece in this business model is actually the driver.
Yeah.
Right? So we then started thinking about what do we do? Okay, what do drivers need? What sort of incentives do we give them? So we started with marketing incentives. You get an extra bonus for every delivery. That worked for a while, but it wasn't strong enough to drive driver retention. And then after a while, looking at the data, we realized that, the single biggest leverage for retaining the driver is having some sort of control over the vehicle. But we didn't want to do that, right? Because at that point in time, especially with Western investors, US investors particularly, I don't know if you heard those terms back then. Uber has become the largest taxi company.
Of course, I heard Uber. I'm like, that's the line. And also, it's like asset light. That's the only way it scales. Yeah. And yes, there's some truth to that.
There is some truth to
that. But I
some
think that
you just have to own the assets.
To start, I think that depending on the stage of the business, it needs different things. Absolutely. And you also have to put the market into context. It's a very delicate dance.
It is a delicate dance. Tell me about it. So for a while we struggled, right? We didn't want to buy vehicles for drivers. Because if you acquire a vehicle, then you then become some sort of bank. Because now,
and then there's a whole question of scale as well.
And then there's a question of scale because you need a lot of money to finance vehicles, right? And then in our heads, we ran the numbers. There's 5 million Okadas, motorcycles in Nigeria. Figure out a way to aggregate them, bring them on board, and all of that. So initially we struggled, and we tried not to get into the vehicle financing, asset finance business. For all of these reasons.
But the banks weren't offering finance, were they?
Fantastic. So the banks as well were not offering financing.
The banks, I don't...
For them, it was high risk, right?
Yeah.
Vehicles?
Of course.
Commercial driver? Hell no, right?
And I think the banks are very specific in the things that they fund. Anything that goes even slightly
outside of
they
Yeah.
just
It's
don't
out
have
of
the
range.
heuristic to be able to.
And so
I
you were
mean,
left
yeah.
with no choice but to fund the vehicles, I'm assuming.
So there were two decisions to be made. First was the decision to say, you know what, actually, we need to fund a few vehicles.
Yeah.
Which was a tough one. But eventually we got there and realized, you know what, forget that whole Uber is a taxi company without a single taxi, blah, blah, blah. This is Lagos. This is Nigeria. This is what the
Let
market
us figure out
needs.
something that actually works
We
for
have to
this
do
market.
stuff.
Yeah.
So we made the decision to fund a few vehicles, right? And I'll tell you, a funny story is the first, I think, 20 motorcycles actually that we deployed, it was trade by barter. I'll explain. So one of the e-commerce companies back then was a company called Payport,
Yes.
right? And they needed logistics support and services, but they didn't know how to hire drivers. They didn't want to deal with all that complexity. So I had to deal with the CEO to say, you know what? So I had a meeting with him one day, and then I saw a bunch of motorcycles parked, new ones. I was like, what are you doing all this? Like, yeah, we bought them, but we can't find drivers. Like, you know what? Why don't you give all of them to us, and then we'll give you delivery credits. So that's how we financed the first set of motorcycles.
That is so clever.
Yeah. So it actually worked, right? And then we were debiting them, of course, over a period of time.
Yeah.
Of course, after a while, we then needed to finance our own motorcycles.
No, but that's very clever to get off the ground. And I wonder, just digging a bit into how that instinct to make that kind of unusual trade came about. Did you have any reference points for something similar that happened, or you just looked at it and said, look, they need this, I need this, let's find a way to do it? Was it simple as that?
Honestly, it was it wasn't like a stroke of genius. I think, when you're early stage, you don't have a lot of money, you have to be...
You're like,
you have to think, right?
It was a survival something.
And which is, sometimes now when I actually do, talk to our management teams and we have conversations, I'm like, okay, because we have some funding now, you guys are no longer like very nimble. Every little thing.
You're not hungry.
I need a budget for this. I need a budget for that. Like guys, this is how we start.
Figure it out.
Man, think creatively. But anyway, so yeah, there wasn't a lot of money, right? We had to make the little money we had raised go as far as possible before we could raise our next venture round. So I guess it gets to the point around maybe sometimes very early in your journey, if you have too much cash, sometimes it could be counterproductive.
Yeah.
Sometimes, not all the time, but sometimes it could be.
On this point with investors, what was the conversation with the early investors like? Because it sounds like, depending on the timing of the markets,
Yes.
the sentiment was different.
Absolutely.
So you and Chinedu had gotten together. You are aligned on the long-term vision. What did that first funding round look like? Being, with the context of the fact that you just finished your MBA, you have some student loan debts. Like, you need funding to be able to take this thing off the
Absolutely.
ground. What was that like?
Yeah, thankfully, we rode the Africa Rising wave back then, right? The demographic data, rising income levels. Income levels will continue to rise. Digitization, the telco infrastructure, smartphone penetration will continue to increase. Smartphones were getting cheaper. Everyone would start ordering stuff on their smartphones. Who's going to enable all of that infrastructure? Us, right? And so it wasn't too hard. Of course, it was still a lot of work talking to investors. Then, because for some of the funds that we spoke to, it was between, backing Max or putting some more money into like Postmates or DoorDash or some of the other, or Deliveroo here in the UK back then. So, but from an Africa standpoint, there wasn't a ton of startups yet at that point in time, which also made it a little hard, right? Because Africa wasn't yet synonymous with venture-backed companies. But still, we found those. That's the beauty of America, right? You still find those investors who still want to take a risk, right? Who are going to write a 50K check without ever having been to Africa before. They just like your energy, your passion. They think you are smart. They think you can get it done. And also, I guess maybe if your company blows up, it's not a big deal to them, I guess.
Get diversified,
They're diversified, right? But yeah, it was still a lot of work, right? Learning how to pitch. And also from my background, right? Because I hadn't been to the US before my grad program. So I didn't fully understand how to pitch, especially to a US audience, right? But I had to learn that.
How did you learn to do that?
A lot of coaching, a lot of mentoring, a lot of reading, and just watching friends and how they do it, right? So Texas was also very helpful for that. Because also, I was much more, the African culture is a little more European in nature, much more conservative, humble. You don't put yourself out too much. And then I remember the culture shock watching my American friends pitch like, wow,
You're like, is it the same business that we just talked about 5 minutes ago?
Like, what is this? And then I started learning that as well. Like, am I lying? Am I pitching? What's going on here?
I think that's really key, right?
Yeah.
Because it doesn't always come naturally,
No.
but there are so many resources out there today
Absolutely.
that enable you to figure out what works for you and how to do it
Yeah.
in a way that will resonate with investors.
Absolutely. I mean, when I mentor a few people now and I explain a few things to them, I'm like, "Oh, you're so naturally good at it." I'm like, I am not naturally good at it.
Don't know.
I learned this stuff from the ground up, right? Because sometimes, people, founders now, maybe some of them get discouraged. No, but this stuff is so hard. No, just learn it, right? If you put your mind to it, learn how it's done. And I also realized at some point, it wasn't just about learning how to pitch. It was also, by going through that process, it actually broadened my vision, right? Because, building a venture-backed company, the reason why, we talked about it a lot in the Techstars program, the fundamental difference between a venture-backed company and an SME, right? SMEs can still be sizable, right? But the whole point why you're venture-backed is that your objective is to be very big, right? And if you can, like, as they say, it's cliche, but if you can, like, talk it, you can see it, you can be it, right? So it's actually really important to even learn how to frame that vision that you have in really aggressive, intense, ambitious language. Because if that isn't there, then it's unlikely that you would even be able to build towards that.
And also, many things that founders don't realize is that investors think of your ability to fundraise as a de-risking factor. I've spoken to thousands of entrepreneurs, and those who can fundraise, yes, that's not the only thing you look at. But those who can pitch, who can fundraise, are likelier to raise and buy themselves more time to go fight. But you could have like the perfect idea. But if you can't raise, you don't have time. And ultimately, time is the differentiator. And I would say the other thing is that same energy, clarity of thought, clarity of vision, compelling like narrative is what you use to get high quality talent.
Absolutely, 100%.
It's the same vein.
It's the exact same thing.
And selling as well to your customers.
Absolutely,
It
it's the
translates
exact
in all
same
areas
thing.
of the business. So it's absolutely key.
So, I never, even right now, I still don't think of myself as a salesperson, right? Weirdly, right? Because I was, focused a lot more on technical stuff growing up. But I realized what I actually do is, right?
You're even selling to, you're selling to prospective employees, you're selling to investors.
Tell me about it.
You are selling.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
I think it's also because people think of sales as like, oh, come on, buy. This is it. Like
exactly.
And it's like, no, it's literally influence.
Absolutely.
It's saying a compelling narrative that
Selling the
resonates
vision.
with an audience that allows them do something that you want them to do, like acquire what you need.
Absolutely. So that's what it is, right? A funny story. I had an executive assistant that worked with me once. He sent me his resignation out of the blue, and I called him up and said, "Hey, what's going on? We should have discussed this before." He sent this email. You know what he told me? He said that I didn't discuss this with you because I knew if I discussed it with you, you would convince
him
me
not to.
And I was like, am I
not compelling? Apparently you are. It's like, I know if that conversation happens, this resignation is not going in.
She's like, okay, that's interesting. Okay, well, but
Take
still,
that as a compliment. I'm sure you'd have been so confused about how to feel it. Should I be like honored or like angry?
it was very confusing, but yeah. Anyway, so yeah, I mean that's what the journey has been like. Our fundraising wasn't easy, but back in 2015, 2016, but there was still enough investors who bought the dream and decided to back us. Yeah.
And you've raised $40 million in equity today,
Correct,
$40 million in debt.
Yeah.
I want to talk a little bit about that debt piece because if you look at the continent, given the level of income per capita and so on, a lot of the largest companies, most successful companies tend to be lending businesses, right? Or there tends to be some component of lending.
Yeah.
I want to talk a little bit about how you navigated raising that debt. I mean, you raised the debt 2 years into starting the business.
First, yes.
What was that like? What are some of the key considerations that anyone thinking about starting a business with a lending component needs to think about?
Yeah, that was a very steep learning curve, right? Because raising debt and equity different, very, very different, right? debt folks.
Especially as a 2-year-old company.
Yeah,
Debt
as
is
a 2-year-old
usually off
company.
the back of cash
Absolutely.
flows.
And I never worked in a bank, right?
Yeah.
So I didn't even know what bankers wanted to hear, right? So I started out by studying them the dream, and then
Like,
after a series of no's, I was like,
show me the revenue.
this dream thing isn't working with these guys. What's going on? What's wrong with you guys?
I'm assuming you optimize for local lenders, right?
Local lenders, yes.
To manage that FX
Yes,
risk
local
and so on,
lenders,
yeah.
absolutely. Yes, that's what we did. And then, of course, eventually, I brought in our first CFO, right? Also got some advice from friends who were in banking on what bankers want to hear. You know, they're always thinking risk. I was like, risk, okay. I mean, we eat risk for breakfast, but if they want us to de-risk the business and show that, you know what, if your money comes into fund vehicles, you'll get the money back. Yeah. And then I started learning things, all sorts of terms around risk, around structure, around different ways to raise debt, etc. And all of that. It was a steep learning curve, as I said earlier, right? But of course, you know, that's what we do as founders. You learn very quickly, right? What you need to learn. So we finally got our first line of credit, interestingly, from a Lagos government initiative, right?
Interesting.
Akin Oyebode then, he ran, what's it called now? LSETF, Lagos State Employment Trust.
I know. Yeah, that's it. Yeah,
Right.
yes.
And had a conversation with him. I mean, Aki is an incredible guy, very passionate about tech, about innovation, etc. Yeah. And we got approved, and we got some financing for them for the next batch, I think, of 30 motorcycles, right? Mm-hmm. And that enabled us to start building track record. Because I also learned, like, with the
very
banks,
quickly.
they want to see some track record, right?
Yeah.
How many vehicles have you done historically? What was payback like? And then we started tracking things like portfolio performance.
Yeah.
That was also my introduction to portfolio performance. I didn't know what that was, right? And all of this debt-related terms. And then we started building a track record. And then slowly we started getting some of the microfinance banks who tend to have a slightly lower threshold than the commercial bank. Commercial banks have very high thresholds for lending, right?
And probably higher values of like debt lines as well. So.
Absolutely. So inch by inch, we started unlocking more debt from microfinance banks, from specialist lenders as well. And then eventually we became much more sophisticated. We started raising international debt. We did a securitization program as well. I did a bond issuance, right, which was very fascinating. It took forever.
Was it okay? It was probably a private bond, not public.
It was private.
Yeah,
it was private. Yes, I mean we didn't have like the ratings yet, right? And then eventually we got to this level of scale where we were able to unlock supplier financing. So we built the company to the point where we then became much more interesting to manufacturers and OEMs, right? In India, in Japan, we managed to bring in one of them as an equity investor, and then through that relationship,
Yamaha, right?
Yamaha, correct?
Yeah.
And then through that relationship, we unlocked supplier finance. But it was different stages. The debt journey really was in phases, right? Very painful. Because I mean, I spoke to a lot of people as well, a lot of bankers who genuinely were very excited by the company and by the model. But their institution,
their risk frameworks will not even allow for it.
Absolutely.
I remember when we were raising for to finance the loan book while I was a general manager at a branch, and we raised a $10 million commercial paper private. So when you said bond issue, I went through that process of do we have to get a rating for a public? And it's such a nascent industry.
Oh, it's so nascent. Yes,
it's so nascent.
Even right now,
and you could see enthusiastic bank, account managers who were like, if it was up to me, I would do this. But like from the risk framework, from even like the first level, you're not going anywhere.
Absolutely.
One bank actually even said, "Oh, we're happy to give you so long as you give us like a 90% cash
back."
And I'm like, okay,
if I had that money, I would come to you, right?
It's like, it doesn't make any sense. So I think it's a framework issue, and obviously this is where there's a gap for innovation in the market as well.
Absolutely. I mean, and we can go into that tangent, right? There's so much that needs to be done in our financial markets to make it a lot deeper, a lot more mature, right? Because that's super critical for fintechs, and not even just for fintechs, right? If you think about Africa, right, one of the biggest issues still is the massive credit gap, right?
Yep.
If you think of most of the products that innovators and founders are delivering on the continent today, not all, but most of it requires some sort of financing or credit at one point of the value chain or the other, right? And unlocking that access is like super, super, super critical. If you think about even, maybe not VC now, but the private equity space, PE, the first PE 1.0.
Yeah.
It was pretty much leveraging debt to stretch the value of your equity. Buy a
Literally,
company
it was,
and then bringing all sorts of debt.
They were just leverage finance.
Leverage buyouts.
Yeah, they just
That was what it was, right?
Yeah.
And when you say leverage, what you mean is debt,
It's
right?
debt, yeah.
But it was in those markets where debt was accessible,
Yeah.
highly developed financial markets. And I think for us in Africa, we've done a lot of work now on innovation. Incredible founders across so many sectors, building fantastic companies. But now there's only so much that can be done with just tech innovation itself. The financial markets now need to catch up to enable us to unlock the next level of impact. Yeah.
And you're playing a bit of a role in that, because I know that you're moving to an asset-light model.
Yes, we are.
Let's talk a little bit about that and how you're looking to work with the banks and innovate.
Yeah, fair enough. So, I mean, think about this, right? When we ran the numbers and looked at Nigeria as a market alone, right? About 100,000 motorcycles and tuk-tuks were sold every month, right? A motorcycle is valued at close to about $1,000, right? So if you do the math, that's about $100 million worth of two-wheelers and three-wheelers sold every month in Nigeria. And there's so many other countries on the continent where all of this stuff is done as well. Where motorcycles are sold at scale: Kenya, Uganda, Tanzania, etc. The challenge is that industry, even till now, is 98 to 99% cash based.
Yeah.
Right. And I'm like, why? Now hold that thought on one side. The banks in Nigeria, particularly the large banks, the commercial banks, still play zero. Right, have zero participation in this industry. So the question is, on the one hand, you've got this huge industry that requires a lot of capital, right? And there's so much demand, etc. But on the other hand, you've got a financial industry that plays almost a zero role in this industry. And the question is, why? Of course, initially, the answer for us was, of course, because the banks are stupid, right? But of course, eventually, we kind of realized, okay, the banks
more nuanced, yeah.
It's more nuanced. There's risk, there's all of this. Issues around the risk and recoverability and portfolio operations and portfolio management. And so we realized, it's actually an opportunity. If we can prove, right, that this industry, if you can make this industry sane, if you can strip out all of the risk with technology, with operations, right, and build a somewhat vertically integrated model.
That has transparency.
That is transparent, provides real-time insights, etc., and plugs all of the key risks, right? It's a matter of time before the financial services industry itself and the banks eventually start playing. And we took on that responsibility to say, let's actually transform this industry. Mm-hmm. And that's what we've been doing. And we've made, tremendous progress. More than 60% of the vehicles that we have been financed since the beginning of Max right now are off balance sheet, right? In the last 2 years, about 80% of them are off balance sheet. And that's because of the work that we've done to, progressively make the industry much more transparent through every single touch point. And it's still work in progress. But to your point, we realize this actually needs to be done even across other industries as well, right? Rather than, because we realize, if you continue to raise debt, if you have to continue to raise debt internally as a company, we'll have to continue to do that forever.
Yeah.
But if you could shift our focus slightly towards solving this problem at the industry level, then we could make it easy such that any bank or lender out there that wants to play in the vehicle finance industry can actually plug in, knowing that they would get their returns, or at least that their assets and their vehicles would be preserved, would be protected at all times.
Yeah, what's so interesting? I'm thinking a lot about how you're transitioning from a mobility tech to a mobility fintech to a mobility software. Almost not because what you're doing is almost offering the rails that allow capital investors actually see the assets of these two-wheelers, three-wheelers vehicles as an asset that they can comfortably purchase in a portfolio as an investment.
Exactly.
Interesting.
Yeah, so that's the journey
you're unlocking so much more capital at scale to facilitate.
Absolutely.
Things.
I mean, that's the only way to unlock. Yeah. Because for us as well, our revenue model then shifts back away from, because, if you think about it this way, when we started out, we didn't want to touch the hard stuff, right? But we then realized, we actually had to touch the hard stuff and do the difficult stuff. And then we did that for a bit. But doing that was very important for us to really understand the problem up close. Because now when we're talking to a lender or a bank, right, we're talking to a bank to say, you can finance drivers that we vetted on our platform, and you can be guaranteed of your returns. And the reason why we can tell you to do this is because we've done this, right? We're not just saying, hey, come and finance vehicles, or come and do stuff that
And
we
here are
don't
the
understand.
receipts. Here's the data.
And here's the
data that
here's
shows
the repayment
that.
history.
Yeah.
We've never defaulted. We've been operational for 9 years. We've never defaulted on a single loan, right? And then they come, they look at that data, and they're like, oh, wow, this is really very interesting. Because for us, if we didn't go through that journey of lending ourselves to the drivers and using corporate debt, we wouldn't really understand. We wouldn't really understand it. But now we understand it. We've built the infrastructure, right? And then we are going back to what's saying, you know what? Now we fixed the hard problems. You guys can come and finance vehicles and play in this industry, and that's really exciting. Now, what's even more exciting is with the transition to electric. It's even much more exciting.
Yeah, massive
because
opportunity.
EVs are even much more difficult to steal.
Yeah.
The maintenance costs are much lower, right? So it's all
And the
coinciding.
impact on the environment is much lower as well.
It's zero emissions.
And I think, because I was reading, I think 60% of Africa is going to be urban by 50 or 30. Can't
it's
remember
urbanizing
now.
very quickly.
Yes, so it's urbanizing, and it's and from a sustainability standpoint, the impact of climate change actually affects
Lagos is
Africans.
very vulnerable to climate
Yeah, because especially coastal areas, rising
Coastal
sea
areas, coastal
levels.
cities,
We're also
absolutely.
depending a little bit on agriculture. So there's that impact on the continent. So whatever we can do, despite the rapid urbanization, to at least be sustainable is going to compound very quickly over time. So that's a bit that I'm sure is even more exciting from a business model standpoint that probably was not as relevant or topical 10 years ago.
No, not as relevant 10 years ago, to be honest, right? Because now, so we started out as a logistics on-demand platform, evolved into a vehicle financing platform, then evolved into a vehicle subscription infrastructure platform, which is what we are now. And then part of that story now is the climate angle as well.
Yeah.
Because now we are in a position to drive a large-scale shift away from internal combustion engines to battery-powered vehicles or electric vehicles, two-wheelers, three-wheelers, and cars. And even tell you, even with cars, right? If you look at some of the models that have been designed lately, there's now a $10,000 electric car. That's really well built,
Incredible.
right? In Nigeria right now, as I speak to you, in Ghana as well, an electric car delivers better economic returns for ride-hailing drivers than a gas engine car, a new one.
Is it because of the savings on the fuel compared to electric and maintenance? Why is that the case?
So those two things. Two things are savings on energy and maintenance. That's number one.
Yeah.
But also there's an artificial one, which is EVs are duty free now.
Oh, so therefore there's a tax benefit.
There's a tax benefit
But
as
then
well.
conversely, with not enough electricity provision in these countries, how do you balance getting an electric vehicle in a country where the power supply isn't constant?
So I have this debate with a few friends who think, for example, in Nigeria, because the Nigerian government is focusing, for example, on CNG and electric. And my view right now is still that electric vehicle penetration will increase faster than CNG.
What's CNG?
Compressed natural gas.
Okay.
And the reason for that is a lot of work needs to go and investments needs to go into building the energy network, retail energy network for CNG, for gas, right? You can't just wake up and say you want to do that.
Yeah.
Right? Big and large investors are required, vast amounts of money are required. For electric, it doesn't actually have to be. You can charge your electric car
The
in your
infrastructure
house,
exists already,
right?
yeah.
So, of course, there still needs to scale, fast charging networks to drive much larger scale adoption. But right now, you can buy an electric vehicle in many African cities. Now, so the point around is energy available, right? I had to answer this question to one of our investors back in our Series A round, because this was the exact same question they asked me, right? They said, but Nigeria doesn't have power. And I said, no, actually, Nigeria has power. It's a question of who wants power, how much are you willing to pay for it, right? Yeah. So when you think about the general Nigerian population, right, do they have reliable access to power? No. But as an enterprise, if you are willing to pay, can you have reliable electricity delivered at specific locations? Absolutely.
Yeah. And then it doesn't even bring the fact that this now opens up the potential for other power generating sources that then become economically viable enough to spur the change that you kind of need to create the supply.
Absolutely. So there's captive power providers, right? Who truck natural gas to specific locations and they produce power there for factories, etc. So there's So there's power in Nigeria. Right? That's the short answer, right? There's a bit nuance, but there is power. And you can channel electricity to specific locations where you need batteries to be charged. And that's what we are doing.
Are you currently operating in Nigeria or in other markets as well?
So yeah, we're in 3 countries now: Nigeria, Cameroon, and Ghana.
Could you talk to us a little bit about that expansion to other markets? Because every market is so different, right? And many African startups have ambitions to scale to multiple markets. How did you navigate that? What were some of the key things that you had to take into consideration?
Yeah, expansion is always hard, right? Like always hard, as you said, because the culture is different, etc. Even the infrastructure readiness is different, right? I think we had launched in Cameroon before we realized that there actually weren't any payment APIs provided by anybody to allow us to do auto reconciliations for our driver payments. Like,
Wow.
We had launched before we even realized that.
Going through that same problem of having to build the infrastructure. I feel like African founders have it on like hard mode because like now you want to expand, but it's no longer last mile. That's the problem. We now need to figure out payments and that's interesting.
So one of the most dynamic documents, if not the most dynamic document we've had at Max, is our expansion playbook, right?
Right.
So of course, day one, if you want to expand into country X, we analyze them along a bunch of dimensions, right? You check this, right? And then from experience, you now realize that actually, check this.
The list just gets longer.
Check if there's a payments infrastructure provider that has APIs available for us, which isn't something you would think of.
Yeah.
You'd be just assume that it's there.
Just assume that it's there.
I think it's getting better. There are lots of entrepreneurs who are building really incredible stuff,
absolutely,
trying to solve 100%. For these real problems.
Absolutely. But I mean, we've learned a lot. Our expansion, as I mentioned, is quite hard, but it's necessary as well. There's 2 sides to it. One is the challenge and the problem that we were solving in Nigeria is the exact same problem across the entire continent, right? Of course, different countries are at different levels of maturity, right? So that's where you analyze and say, okay, if you look at Ghana, Senegal, Cameroon, Uganda, which one should we go next, right? And you also think about it, very funny thing we learned after a few years is, let's go into markets where there's no competition. But eventually you realize, no.
There's a reason why there's no competition.
There's a reason why they're there.
Oh my God.
Where they are is where we should go. If they didn't go here, we don't know why. There's probably a reason why.
I learned this firsthand.
Yeah, like it's that first mover advantage. It can be a disadvantage. And the thing is that, and I think like also because we saw this at Uber, Uber launched and then Bolt and the other guys. But Uber had gotten all the battle scars, like had built supply, had trained drivers, and then everyone then came. And they just come in and take, now the market is less. So if somebody has not gone there, think twice. If I go and ask them, how far?
There must be a hidden
reason that we didn't see. But
So now we call it first mover shaggy, right? Which is,
I love that.
Oh gosh.
Yeah, I mean, you learn these things. Back in the day, there was the excitement of novelty. But the first there, let's wait for them for a year.
And then
let's see.
Then we'll follow them there.
I love it. The other thing I wanted us to touch on a little bit was just more around the team. It was you and Chinedu, and then you had to build out the team. How large is the team now? Because it's been 10 years.
FTEs, full-time equivalents, full-time employees, about 300 now.
And in terms of driver network?
Driver network, current active driver base, about 23,000.
Now, it's so you have a lot of employees, and then you have these, external providers. Had you led a team before starting? No. So I would love for you to share a little bit about the nuances of how did you figure out what culture you wanted in the organization between you and Chinedu? How do you think about the first few hires? Yeah. Just some snippets on the way you thought about it, heuristics, things that worked, things that didn't work. That would be very helpful.
Absolutely. I mean, when people ask me, what would I change, right? The one big thing that I would change is my approach to building the team, right? I would have done some things much earlier, right? If I knew, but hindsight is 2020. I and Chinedu were fortunate to have some really, really solid mentors and coaches very early on who we would go to regularly just to talk, chat, share.
Where did you find these coaches?
For example, through the Texas Network, right? Then I work with Sim Shagaya as well, so I'll go back to him.
People you worked with before,
to get some thoughts from him as well. So that was really helpful for us. But of course, a lot of that learning was still personal. Doing research, trial and error, right? You do this and then someone resigns and like, why did they resign? Okay, because I did this. Okay, next time I won't do that, right? But yeah, that was, if I could go back in time, I would place much more emphasis and importance on building the team much earlier, right? Making sure that people were motivated. Also doing a lot of research on them, understanding their backgrounds. Because we also made a few mistakes where we brought in people who are very smart, aced their interviews, but weren't ready for the startup struggle, right? Or people who are very smart, but needed like large teams to be effective, right? Who, couldn't be very productive with a team of like, maybe where they were coming from, they had like a team of 20, but here it's a team of like 1, right? Or 2, your assistant at your table, right?
Just more practically speaking, for anyone that's looking to hire, how do you identify some of those things today when you're hiring?
We have a framework we use, and I can't remember all the details right now, but one is energy is super important for us, right? If you're like super smart, but you're not like high energy, it doesn't work.
Yeah.
It doesn't work. Like we will take like, intermediate intelligence and high energy over, and that sounds strange, but sometimes there's so much emphasis on strategy, and I think a day and asked ourselves and said, how many strategies do we need in this company? if the two of us can't strategize, then we should be. What's the point? So then we realized that, when we go into conversations and we are dazzled with like strategic insights, it's great, but it's not enough.
Yeah.
So we look for a history of execution, of being very hands-on. Right? And sometimes people think maybe hands-on means that you can't delegate. No. What we mean by hands-on is being very, very involved in the problem-solving process.
But does this change across the stages of the company, though?
Yes, it does. It does. So I'd say first maybe 2 to 4 years, you need a lot of people who can really, really execute, right? You also need some people who can still think, right? Who are still strategists. That's still super important. As the company scales, at the management level, you then need people who can build teams. And that's where it gets very complex because now you're looking for 3 or 4 capabilities such that if any of them is missing, it still doesn't work. So at the senior level, now I'll tell you, the most important thing at the senior level for us is actually humility.
I love that.
Because what we found is that some of the skills that are needed to lead, they're not really difficult. It's not like they're not that difficult to learn. But what we found to be really difficult was when we had people who are like smart and accomplished, and felt like they were beyond learning, right?
That just became a blocker.
It was a massive blocker, right? But people who had experience, had been and done that, etc., but still were humble enough to take feedback and realize that, okay, it's a little different here. It's a little different in this industry. I also don't know it all. I'll bring on team members who will be more technically capable than I am. But of course, you then provide leadership. We found that humility and the willingness to learn, and also the speed of learning, right?
Yes.
Was super, super important for leadership, particularly for leadership, like super, super critical. High energy as well.
Yeah.
High energy. Yeah.
Incredible. Thank you so much. Honestly, you've shared
for having me.
So many gems.
Yeah.
I'm sure that, our listeners are having their notebooks out, taking notes on this episode.
Hopefully, yeah.
But before we wrap up, one thing that we always like to ask our guests is, if we were in a time machine, take us back to right when you were at MIT, before you started the company.
Okay.
What is one thing that you'll tell your younger self?
And you have like 30 seconds.
Okay.
No pressure.
Yeah. I would say people, right? Focus, spend a lot of time thinking through who you want to bring on board, right? And after you bring them on board, how do you want to build relationships with them? How do you want to motivate and inspire them? All of that, the time maybe that I would have spent trying to like fix a technical problem that I should have invested in, achieving more alignment, communicating better. I would, if I could do it all over again, I would spend, if I had to choose between communicating much more effectively with people and with my colleagues and team members, I would prioritize that over everything else, even over like building the product. because it's ultimately the people who then still build the
Go on
product.
to build
Yeah.
product.
Yeah.
And one other question. So many of our listeners may be thinking about taking the leap themselves.
Yeah.
What's one piece of advice that you'd give to them? You know, if they have an idea, they're about to, you know, work on executing on it, what would you tell them?
Go for it, right? You know, it's always harder if you wait, right? Yeah, it's always harder.
The longer you wait, the harder it gets.
There's the idea that, you know, some think, okay, you know, I need to get a little more experience and then I can build a proper venture. No. It's always, to build a venture, you need, energy is more important than almost anything else. And, you know, I don't know the age or the moment at which we peak in our energy levels, right? But after a while, it starts declining. You definitely want to take on, try and go for your dreams when you have the highest amount of energy.
Yeah.
And earlier is almost always better.
I love that. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
It's lovely to have you.
Glad to be here as well. Thanks.
Thank you for tuning in to another episode of the Startup Leap, TSL for short. Leave a review, tell us what you think of this episode on all our platforms at the Startup Leap Pod. Do you have a question? Ask us and we'll ask our guest. Go to thestartupleap.io. See you next time.